Hello, AP Bio folks. Today we're going to start pulling together all the things we've talked about in this unit and use our main focus of plants to talk about how water moves through plants. We're going to talk about some plant anatomy and also review a little bit of water chemistry that's involved in this process as well. So first, I just want you to think about what you already know about this. This is something that we talk about a little bit in 10th grade biology. So review what you remember about how water moves through plants, thinking about the structures, the parts of plants that help water move through, and the chemistry of water and how both of those things play a role. The basics of this obviously are really simple. Water comes in through the roots, it moves up through a plant stem, and then it goes out through the leaves through this process of transpiration. Remember that word transpiration that you can see on the diagram here just means evaporation out of the pores, those stoma in the leaves of plants. The really amazing thing about this whole process is that absolutely none of it requires energy. So we're going to go through this kind of piece by piece, starting with the roots and moving up through the plant to follow the path of water as it goes through. So as water enters the roots, roots obviously main function is to absorb water and other nutrients from the soil. Many roots have specialized cells on the surface that have these little projections that you see in that diagram called root hairs. They increase the surface area, which allows the roots to take in more water and nutrients. These root hair cells use some of their energy to actively pump elements like nutrients and ions into the cell. That's the little purple dots you see in that picture. Once they've increased the concentration of those nutrients, those ions inside the cell, then water follows. Water also moves into the cell through the process of osmosis. And that doesn't require any energy at all. This creates something called root pressure. If you look at the cell in the picture on the screen right now, you can imagine it kind of getting full of water, and that water has to go somewhere. And so there's actually a little pressure, a little squeezing from the bottom of the plant. There's all this water coming in that has to go somewhere. And so that's the first piece that starts to push water up through the roots of a plant. As the water comes in, it has a bunch of dissolved nutrients in it, and that combination of water and nutrients enters a tissue in the plant called the xylem, and that solution is called the xylem sap. It's what moves up from the roots through the rest of the plant, bringing the water and those nutrients with it. As we talk about the rest of this movement, once the water is in the plant, it has to move up through the stem or the trunk if it's a tree, all the way up to the leaves. And that movement is very similar to liquid moving upwards through a straw. This is an analogy we're going to use as we go through and talk about this. There are a couple of pictures on the screen right now that help to illustrate how this works. So the water comes in through the roots. And remember, we said the water coming into the roots creates a little bit of upward pressure, that root pressure pushing from the bottom. As the roots get full of water, that naturally starts kind of squeezing some of the water upwards. The chemistry of water is also helpful as it starts moving up. This picture on the bottom, I can see some of the words are covered up there, but because water is a polar molecule, there's adhesion between the water molecules and the sides of the xylem that helps the water to stick to the sides of that tube. There's also cohesion between the water molecules that helps the water to stick together, and both of those help the water to kind of fight against gravity as it moves up through here. This movement of water up through plants is called bulk flow. It moves in bulk in big amounts, and it's only due to differences in pressure. There's this pushing from the roots. There's also, kind of like when you're drinking a straw, there's pulling at the top that we'll talk about in a minute. And so this happens only because of these differences in pressure, the push and pull, not because of differences in solute concentration, which can also make water move, but not in this case. It happens pretty quickly through a plant. Water moves through plants very fast. If you've ever had a plant that was really wilty and needed water, you may have seen this because you can water a plant and you can almost watch the leaves start to kind of stand back up as the water gets to them. The reason it's so quick is the cells that make up the xylem, once they are mature and functional, they're actually dead cells and they have very little cytoplasm in there and almost no organelles. So they're basically like a hollow tube that allows water to move up really fast. The main force, root pressure is a little force, but the main force that helps move water through a plant is called transpirational pull. Remember, transpiration is that evaporation out of the stomatal pores, out of the openings in a leaf at the top. This is very much like sucking on the top of a straw. It creates a negative pressure. Think of negative pressure like suction, sucking on something. It actually creates a little bit of a vacuum throughout the whole plant system. And so when that water transpires or evaporates out of the leaves of the plants, that pulls more water up all the way from the roots through the entire plant. And that transpirational pull is strong enough to get water all the way up to the tops of the tallest trees without using any energy at all. And of course, like we talked about at the beginning, the adhesion and cohesion between those water molecules helps it to climb that high and fight against gravity. This whole movement is regulated then at the top on those leaves by the opening and closing of those stomata. Stomata are those pores on the leaf surfaces that allow water to evaporate. And these pores have a couple different functions. Their main purpose actually is not transpiration. That's just kind of a side effect. The main purpose of these openings on a leaf cell is to allow carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis. So I'll kind of see if I can label this. So the main purpose of these is this is how the plant breathes. This is how it takes in CO2. And after photosynthesis is done, this is also how it releases oxygen. So that's actually the main purpose of opening and closing these stomata. Stoma is the singular of that word. But just like with anything else, since plants have a lot of water in them, whenever those stoma are open, transpiration also happens and water is able to evaporate. So plants are always kind of playing a balancing game. They need to open their stomata enough to take in enough carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but they also don't want to lose too much water when those are open. So they need to close them whenever they're not actively doing photosynthesis, when they don't need that carbon dioxide. So this process of transpiration that pulls water up through the plant is regulated by opening and closing these stomata. There are these two cells on the side of each stomatal opening that are called the guard cells. And you can see in this picture on the right, those guard cells are closed. When these guard cells do not contain very much water, their cell membranes are kind of loose and lax. These cells are called flaccid, and the pore is closed. If the plant needs to open these cells, what it does is it actively pumps potassium ions, that's these little red dots around the outside. It uses energy to pump those into these guard cells. And it will do that in response to a few different triggers. A lot of plants do this in response to light. So they will open up their pores more during the day when light's available for photosynthesis, and they'll close those stomata at night. It can also happen if the plant is low in carbon dioxide, then it needs to open those stomata. So it'll pump potassium ions in then as well. Plants do also have a circadian rhythm, kind of that internal clock that tells you when it's time to wake up and when it's time to go to sleep. That's part of this regulation. And other environmental stresses can also trigger a plant to pump potassium ions into those guard cells. And when that happens, just like in the root hair cells, when the concentration of ions gets higher inside of the cell, then the water follows. Water also gets pulled into that cell just through osmosis. Again, there's no energy in the water movement. And then as those cells fill up with water, that makes them more turgid. That's that word. And as they kind of fill up and take on that shape, it opens that stomatal pore, which then allows the water to transpire out through those pores, which again is like sucking on the top of a straw, and it pulls the water all the way up through the plant. Today, you're going to be working on a virtual lab, if you're at home, to look at these structures in a little more detail and review their functions. As you go through and do this virtual lab, please continue to think about the role that all these different structures play in moving water through a plant. Contact me if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day.